What did my son do when my husband kept taking credit for things my son did at school? Monday dinner. My husband Alan is telling his coworker story. He does this. He tells a story. It comes out polished. It sounds great. Tonight, he's telling my sister about how our son got the highest score in the math competition. He says, yeah, we worked on it every night. He says we, and he nods, and he looks accomplished. My 11-year-old son, Kit, is eating dinner. He stops chewing, he looks at Alan, he finishes chewing, he swallows, he says, Dad? Alan says, yeah, bud. Kit says, we didn't work on it every night. Alan says, Kit, we studied together. Kit says, once? Alan says, it was more than once. Kit opens his notebook. He has a study log. He keeps a study log because he is extremely organized and I have no idea where he got it from. He reads the log. He says, I studied 12 nights total. He shows Alan the log. He says, your name appears on one night. He points to it. He says, November 9th. He looks at Alan. He says, that was the night you helped me with the quadratic formula. He pauses. You looked it up first. Alan looks at the log. He looks at November 9th. He looks at Kit. He says, I also helped you with. Kit turns the page. He says, I have notes from every session. He reads. He says, November 2nd. He reads the notes. He says, Khan Academy. He says, November 5th. He reads. He says, Mom. He looks at my sister. He says, Mom helped me on 5 of the 12 nights. He shows the log. 5 nights have Mom written next to them. 1 night has Dad, with a note in parentheses that says, looked up quadratic first. He points to the parenthetical. He says, I noted it because it was helpful. He says, just accurate. Alan looks at the parenthetical. Kit closes the log. He says, Dad, I won because I studied 12 nights. He looks at Alan. He says, you were part of one of them. He pauses. He says, that matters. He says it clearly. He says, November 9th was a good night. Alan looks at the log. Kit says, but we is not accurate. Alan says, Kit says, at school you can tell people your son won the math competition. He says, that's true. He says, you don't have to say we. He says, I'm your son. He looks at him. He says, that's enough. Alan is quiet for a while. My sister is looking at her plate. She is very interested in her plate. I am eating my dinner. I am eating it very peacefully. Alan says, you're right. Kit nods. He says, I know. He opens the log to a new page. He writes something. He shows Alan. He's written, November 9th, quadratic formula, Dad. He looks at Alan. He says, that stays in the log. Alan looks at the entry. He says, just the one night. Kit says, just the one night. He says, but it's in there. Alan nods. Kit closes the log. He goes back to his dinner. He eats for a moment. Then he says, also. Alan says, yeah. Kit says, the quadratic explanation you gave me was actually really clear. Alan looks at him. He says, yeah? Kit says, better than Khan Academies. He eats a bite. He says, I should have noted that in the log. He opens it again. He adds a note next to November 9th. He shows Alan. It says, good explanation, better than KA. Alan reads it. He looks at Kit. He says, thank you. Kit says, it's accurate. He closes the log. He puts it in his bag. He finishes dinner. He does his own dishes. He rinses them and puts them in the dishwasher without being asked because that is who he is. Alan watches him do the dishes. He looks at me. He says, one night. I say, one night. He says, better than Khan Academy though. I say, he wrote it down. Alan nods. He does his own dishes too. He puts them next to Kit's. Kit sees this from the hallway. He goes to the notebook. He writes it. He shows me later. It says, Alan did dishes without being asked. First recorded instance. He shows me the date. He shows me the time. He has the time. He says, I want to see if it's a pattern or a one-time thing. I look at him. He's 11. He has a log. He's tracking dish patterns. He closes the notebook. He says, good night, Mom. He goes to bed. I stand in the kitchen thinking about the fact that my son just ran a data collection experiment on his father using dinner dishes. All hail Kit, age 11, 12-night study logger, parenthetical note writer, 1 recorded instance. He's watching for the pattern.